R350 COVID-19 Social Relief of Distress grant. It was extended by government for a year. That was announced by the President in the State of the Nation address on Thursday. It comes amidst a debate with some saying South Africa can't afford more support to the poor, others saying South Africa can't afford not to support the poor with a much more substantial grant and risk further instability in society. To discuss, we're now joined by Dominic from the Alternative Information and Development Centre. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Brown. I think you've looked at, firstly, the context. Just give us the extent of hunger in South Africa right now.
Well, we're living in a context where more than 55% of the population earn below 1,335 rand per month. And there's been studies that indicate that an adult requires at least 1,400 rand per month per person to be able to, for sufficient food provision per month. So this levels of income indicates why there's so many people, more than 10 million adults, and I think these are conservative estimates, who go hungry each week, 3 million of which are children. And I think if you consider the context of mass unemployment, where there's almost half of the working age population who are unemployed, gives a sense of the social crisis faced by the majority of South Africans at the moment.
And looking at the figures, you think, how did people survive before they even received the 350 rand? What sort of difference? So it's way below the poverty line, any which way you look at it. But what sort of difference has it made?
No, of course, if you have nothing, then even 10 rand makes some kind of difference. But I think the question is, what's a human existence? And I don't think the 350 rand cuts it. And in engagements with many unemployed people, for them, the 350 rand, it's quite tokenistic. Many of them would prefer a proper job with a decent income. And many of them are making demands on government and on the private sector to create an economy that employs many, many more people. And they are arguing that we need a reindustrialization strategy where we invest large levels of public resources, public finances, in a job-creating strategy that addresses the mass housing problem we have in the country, transportation, education, healthcare, all of which requires a large number of people to work.
All right. Well, what do you think of what the President was saying then? What's your perspective? You know, in South Africa's past, there has been a lot of antagonism, you could say, between government and corporations. He said to some murmurs, to some applause, it was a mixed reaction, that it is businesses that create jobs.
This is quite ironic. It's as if we have learned nothing from the pandemic. During the pandemic, when we needed healthcare workers, we turned to the public sector to employ them. I think it's indicative of when there's an emergency, the states can definitely be a major employer. The fact that the private sector employs 80% of the current total levels of employment in the country illustrates that, one, the public sector is heavily understaffed. So if you take the size of the public sector in South Africa and compare it as the size of the economy, the size of the population to many other countries, including African states, and the public sector in our country comes up way smaller, which of course exemplifies the fact that we need tens of thousands more healthcare workers, tens of thousands more teachers, tens of thousands of more municipal workers. So that's number one. Number two, I think we've been overly reliant on the private sector to create jobs in South Africa for some time. And I think we've seen the problems that results from that, in that we've seen an hemorrhaging of jobs and a growing unemployment crisis in this country. So the private sector hasn't been able to deliver, and there's very little incentives for them to deliver. So in fact, what the president and government has done is it's abdicated itself of all responsibilities to address the deep socioeconomic crisis in this country. And instead, what we are seeing is a deep commitment and, in fact, a dogmatic belief that the market will deliver, in spite of the fact of empirical evidence indicating that it has failed to deliver over more than 4 decades in South Africa and globally. And so it's in that context that we must come to the conclusion that the South African government does not have a reasonable or an adequate response to the socio-economic crisis in this country. The irony is that the main opposition party, the DA, believes that the ANC does, which shows that both the ANC and the DA will lead this country down a cul-de-sac. Now, that's not to say that any party currently has a solution to the crisis that we're facing, and I think we need a complete rethink about how we go forward if we are to address.
Well, I mean, if you were there at the table, let's end with this. Where do you start? So you're saying start with employing, despite the strain on our finances, you still need to employ more state workers where it counts.
Absolutely. So the argument that South Africa has constrained finances is a political rather than a technical question. Based on our technical arguments and analysis, South Africa is actually quite well endowed when it comes to its resources domestically. For example, if we had to implement a general anti-tax avoidance act and halt the large amounts of illicit financial flows that occurs due to transnational corporations shifting profits out to South Africa, that alone would raise more than 100 billion rand in revenue each year. There's also the possibilities of redirecting large levels of investment from the Johannesburg Stock Exchange into the real economy, for example, into the housing economy, into transport, and to transforming Eskom to becoming a fully public renewable energy utility. Now, the government employees pension fund currently has over 2 trillion rand in accumulated reserves, half of which is in the JSE. This is to no benefit of any public sector workers at all. This is to no benefit of any retired public sector worker. This is only to the benefit of shareholders and major CEOs who are already being paid more than 1.7 million rand each year.
Can I stop you there? I'm just trying to understand, aren't retired public sector workers doing very well in South Africa because of the performance of shares and the good investment strategies in the past by the likes of the PIC?
So when we look first of all, we should look at some of the investments under the PAC, under the PIT, of IO technology. There's many skeptical investments that should be placed under scrutiny, number one. Number two, it was during the pandemic when they took a major loss to the PIC as a result of the investments in the JSE, because investments into assets and to the share market comes with high risk and volatility. Instead, you can invest that in domestic bonds, in government bonds. And if you do that, you create a huge amount of fiscal room. And when you invest in government bonds, by the way, that also comes with stable returns on investment, higher than often market rates if you look at it over the long run. So actually, we've been very fortunate that the market has turned out in our favor. But things can turn south very easily. Yeah. And instead, we should be looking for a much more secure and stable long-term investment strategy that also thinks about socioeconomic determinants, like how do we reindustrialize our economy? And so if we think about it like that, then we have to put the whole South African macroeconomic framework and its investment strategy into question.
All right. Well, thank you for your time tonight. Dominic Brown from the Alternative Information and Development Centre. We started off there talking about the 350 Rand grant. It has been extended for another year, but agreeing with many of the voices across society, some of them actually business groups saying that we need something much more substantial and at a much higher level to support the poor, given poverty, given inequality in South Africa. Let's take a look at your sporting